Young Wilcox's rejoinder, which impressed my uncle enough to make him recall and record it verbatim, was of a fantastical poetic cast which must have typified its whole conversation, and which I have since found highly characteristic of him. He said, "It is new, indeed, and for I made it last night in a dream of strange cities, and dreams are older than brooding Tyre, or the contemplative Sphinx, or garden gilded Babylon." It was then that he began that rambling tale which suddenly played upon a sleeping memory, and won the fervent interest of my uncle. There had been a slight earthquake tremor the night before, the most considerable felt in New England for some years, and Wilcox's imagination had been keenly affected. Upon retiring, he had an unprecedented dream of great cyclopean cities of Titan blocks and sky-flung monoliths, all dripping with green ooze and sinister with latent horror. Hieroglyphics had covered the walls and pillars. From some undetermined point below had come a voice that was not a voice, a chaotic sensation which only fancy could transmute into sound, but which he attempted to render by almost unpronounceable jumbles of letter Cthulhu Fatag. This verbal jumble was the key to the recollection which excited and disturbed Professor Angle. He questioned the sculptor at scientific minuteness and studied with almost frantic intensity bas relief on which the youth had found himself working. Chilled and clad under his night clothes, when waking had stolen bewildering over him, my uncle blamed his old age. Wilcox afterward said, for his slowness in recognizing both hieroglyphic and pictorial design. Many of his questions seemed highly out of place to his visitor, especially those which tried to connect the latter with strange cults or societies. The Wilcox could not understand the repeated promises of silence which he had offered in exchange for an admission of membership in some widespread mystical or paganly religious body. When Professor Angell became convinced that the sculptor was indeed ignorant of any cult or system of cryptic lore, he besieged the visitor with demands for future reports of dreams. This bore regular fruit, for after the first interview, the manuscript records daily calls of the young man, during which he related startling fragments of nocturnal imagery whose burden was always some terrible cyclopean vista of dark and dripping stone, with a subterranean voice or intelligence shouting monotonously in enigmatical sense impacts, uninscribable save as gibberish. The two sounds most frequently repeated are those rendered by the letters Cthulhu and R'lyeh. On March 23rd, the manuscript continued. Wilcox failed to appear, and inquiries at his quarters revealed that he'd been stricken with an obscure sort of fever and taken to the home of his family in Waterman Street. He had cried out in the night, arousing several other artists in the building, and had manifested since then only alterations of unconsciousness and delirium. My uncle at once telephoned the family, and from that time forward kept close watch of the case, calling often at the Thayer Street office of Dr. Tobey, whom he learned to be in charge. The youth's febrile mind apparently was dwelling on strange things, and the doctor, shuddered now and then as he spoke of them. They included not only a repetition of what he had formerly dreamed, but touched widely on gigantic thing mile high, which walked or lumbered about. He at no time fully described this object, but occasionally frantic words, as repeated by Dr. Beaubet, convinced the professor that it must be identical with the nameless monstrosity he had sought to depict in his dream sculpture. Reference to this object, the doctor added, was invariably a prelude to the doctor's young man's subsidence to lethargy. His temperature, oddly enough, was not greatly above normal, but his whole condition was otherwise such as to suggest true fever rather than mental disorder. On April 2nd, at about 3 p.m., every trace of Wilcox's malady suddenly ceased. He sat upright in bed, astonished to find himself at home and completely ignorant of what had happened in dream or reality since the night of March 22nd. Pronounced well by his physician, he returned to his quarters in 3 days, but to Professor Angle he was of no further assistance. All traces of strange dreaming had vanished into his recovery, and my uncle kept no record of his night thoughts after a week of pointless and irrelevant accounts of thoroughly usual visions. Here the first part of the manuscript ended, but references to certain of the scattered notes gave me much material for thought, so much, in fact, that only the ingrained skepticism then forming my philosophy can account for my continued distrust of the artist. The notes in question were those depictive of the dream of various persons covering the same period as that in which young Wilcox had his strange visitations. My uncle, it seems, had quickly instituted a prodigiously far-flung body of inquiries amongst nearly all the friends whom he could question without impertinence, asking for nightly reports of their dreams and the dates of any notable visions for some time past. The reception of his request seems to have varied, but he must, at the very least, have received more responses than any ordinary man could have handled without a secretary. This original correspondence was not preserved, but his notes formed a thorough and really significant digest. Average people in society and business, New England's traditional salt of the earth gave an almost completely negative result, though scattered cases of uneasy but formless nocturnal impressions appear here and there, always between March 23rd and April 2nd, the period of young Wilcox's delirium. Scientific men were little more affected, though 4 cases of vague descriptions suggest fruitive glimpses of strange landscapes, and in one case there is mentioned a dread of something abnormal. It was from the artists and poets that the pertinent answers came, and I know that panic would have broken loose had they been able to compare notes. It was, lacking their original letters, I have suspected the compiler of having asked leading questions, or having edited the correspondence in corroboration of what he had latently resolved to see. This was why I continued to feel that Wilcox, somehow cognizant of the old data which my uncle had possessed, had been imposing on the veteran scientist. These responses from Aesthetic told a disturbing tale. From February 28th to April 2nd, and a large proportion of them had dreamed very bizarre things. The intensity of the dream being immeasurable, the stronger during the period of the sculptor's delirium. Over a month of those who reported anything reported scenes and half sounds, not unlike those which Wilcox had described, and some of the dreams confessed acute fear of a gigantic nameless thing visible toward the last. Own case, which the note described with emphasis, was very sad. The subject, a widely known architect with leanings towards theosophy and occultism, went violently insane on the night of young Wilcox's seizures and expired several months later after incessant screaming to be saved from some escaped denizens of hell. Had my uncle referred to these cases by name instead of merely by number, I should have attempted some corroboration and personal investigation, but as it was, I succeeded in tracing down only a few. All of these, however, bore out the notes in full. I have often wondered if all the objects of the professor's questioning felt as puzzled as did this fraction. It is well that no explanation shall ever reach them. The press cuttings, as I have intimated, touched on cases of panic, mania, and eccentricity during the given period. Professor Engel must have employed a cutting bureau, for the number of extracts had tremendous, and the sources scattered throughout the globe. Here, a nocturnal suicide in London, where a lone sleeper had leaped from a window after a shocking cry. Here, likewise, a rambling letter to the editor of a paper in South America, where a fanatic deduces a dire future from visions he has seen. A dispatch from California describes a theosophist colony as donning white robes en masse for some glorious fulfillment, which never arrives, while items from India speak guardingly of serious native unrest toward the end of March. Voodoo orgies multiply in Haiti, and African outposts report ominous mutterings. American officers in the Philippines find certain tribes bothersome about this time, and New York policemen are mobbed by historical Levantines on the night of March 23rd to 24th. The west of Ireland, too, is full of a wild rumor and legendary, and a fantastic painter named Ardos Bonald hangs a blasphemous dreamscape in the Paris Spring Salon of 1926, and so numerous are the recorded troubles in insane asylums that only a miracle can have stopped the medical fraternity from noting strange parallelisms and drawing mystified conclusions. A weird branch of cuttings, all told, and I can at this date scarcely envision the callous rationalism with which I set them aside. But I have then convinced that young Wilcox had been known of the older matters mentioned by the professor. That's part one for today. Take care. To comment below. Furthermore, find me on Twitter. Bye bye.